I'd like to call the work session to order for July 18, 2022. Will the city clerk please read the roll?
Let the record reflect that all members are present.
We have one item on the agenda tonight. I would like to remind council that staff will be pausing intermediately to answer any questions. Item discuss the short-term rentals, and please introduce yourself.
Hello, Mayor and Council. Jenna Carrico, Government Relations Manager. Earlier this year, Julie came to you to review our options to regulate short-term rentals. As we were in the middle of the legislative session and there was momentum on a consensus agreement between industry and cities, we opted to hold off until we knew the full scope and tools that would be at our disposal. Before we get into what was passed this year, which Jay will cover, I wanted to provide just a quick legislative recap to remind you and viewers at home how we got here. Jay, will you hit next, please?
Sorry.
Thank you. Short-term rental is statutorily defined and generally understood to be property rented out for fewer than 29 days or less per period. Most are listed on an online lodging marketplace like Airbnb and VRBO. Next, please. In 2016, the legislature preempted cities and towns from regulating or prohibiting short-term rentals. Now, Congresswoman Debbie Lesko and Governor Ducey championed this issue through the legislature at the time, with significant backing from industry. There are expectations in the law made for protecting public health and safety, so we're able to respond to otherwise illegal activity, disturbances, or unruly behavior. A couple years later, in 2019, it was already apparent the gaps in enforcement this 2016 law had created, and the League of Cities and Towns worked with stakeholders to find an avenue that allows cities to require short-term rental owners to provide contact information for someone who's responsible for responding to complaints in a timely manner before advertising or renting their unit. Attempts were made in both 2020 and 2021 to provide for more local control, pushed especially hard by communities like Sedona, Scottsdale, and Paradise Valley, but ultimately fell short for a myriad of reasons. Next, please. We are very pleased to see that this year Senate Bill 1168 made it through the process with overwhelming bipartisan support during the final days of the session. As Jay will get into, this bill will allow cities more options to help regulate this industry in our communities.
Mr. Mayor and council members, the new short-term rental state law created a new regulatory framework that allows the city to impose kind of 8 new processes to regulate short-term rentals that we're going to discuss in detail. The first decision for the city is whether the city's short-term rental ordinance will require a permit or a license. The city's finance department currently issues a business license to STR owners and charges a $75 fee. City staff recommends that the city's STR ordinance require an STR license in lieu of a business license and charge a license fee up to $250, as is allowed by the new state law. You've seen this before. The city staff is recommending that, kind of carried over from what you saw earlier this year, I think in the end of February, is that if there is an emergency out at the property, the STR owner or their designated person will have to respond within 1 hour if public safety is there. Also, if it's just a complaint, the ordinance will probably reflect that they just have to respond within 24 hours. And then I think we're going to be looking at, once again, a minimum fee if they don't respond in a timely manner of $250. The statute allows for a new aspect. The city's ordinance can allow, when a new short-term rental comes into the neighborhood, that the STR owner has to notify the adjacent properties. What does that mean? That means adjacent to, directly or diagonally across the street. And if it's a multifamily property where the STR is, it will just mean those units on the same floor. The staff is recommending that the city's STR ordinance require neighborhood notification as allowed by the new state law. The new state law also came up with a kind of a new defined term, a verified violation. What is a verified violation? That means that you were given a civil citation or you were given a criminal citation, and the court has found you responsible for the civil offense or you're convicted of the criminal offense. And the state law allows you, the city's ordinance, to require a $500, $1,000, and a $3,500 civil fine for your first, second, and third violation. The state law is also quite specific in what the city can do to suspend a license. It says that our STR ordinance has to create an administrative process. And in that administrative process, though, we can only suspend an STR license, and I keep saying licenses because that's what we're going to recommend instead of a permit, in any rolling 12-month period. So you'd have to be convicted 3 times within 12 months. So it's going to be pretty hard to suspend an STR license. Otherwise, you can suspend if there's something quite bad that happens, like a felony offense, a serious physical injury or wrongful death, a sexual offender or adult-oriented business use happens at the property, or the STR owner knowingly or intentionally allows a non-residential use of the STR. It's interesting that the state law, though, was silent and seems to provide no type of process for the city to revoke an STR license, only suspend for 12 months. If a short-term rental owner goes through VRBO or Airbnb, those online online marketplaces actually do a background check to make sure that the short-term rental is not being rented to a sexual offender. Otherwise, the state allows, and city staff is recommending that the city's short-term rental ordinance requires sexual offender background checks. In addition, the new state law allows the city to require liability insurance. Once again, if the short-term rental owner uses an online marketplace, that $500,000 is provided by the online marketplace. Otherwise, they're going to have to get their own insurance. City staff is recommending that we require liability insurance. In addition, the state law allows us to require the STR owner display the city's license number on all of its advertisements. And once again, we're recommending that our ordinance reflect that. So what you saw on February 28th, at that point, the state law only allowed the city to have a registration system. Now the new state law says that you can regulate with a license or a permit. What we see following through, and we've already talked about, is our 1 hour of public safety is at the property. 24-hour, if there's a 24-hour complaint, if there's a complaint, just respond within 24 hours. Otherwise, they have to comply with all public health, safety, sanitation, property tax registration, property maintenance laws. A short-term rental, a short-term rental, it's a residential property, so it can't be used for a non-residential use. You can't just all of a sudden have a house being rented out as a wedding venue. In addition, the state law allows our ordinance to say that There will be no sexual offenders or sober living homes. You can't sell illegal drugs, liquor, or allow adult-oriented uses at the property. So kind of in summary, city staff is recommending that our ordinance reflect the 8 kind of new things that the state law has come up with that are listed in front of you. As kind of a timeline, just recently, Senate Bill 1168 was passed by both the State House and Senate. About a week later, or 10 days later, the governor signed it, and we're here in front of you. We expect to come back on September 12th with a draft, hopefully final ordinance for the city council to consider and hopefully adopt. The new state law does not become effective until September 24th. And we know that we're coming back before the new state law becomes effective, but it's city staff recommendation that we kind of use the rest of 2022 to kind of do a type of notification and education to STR owners and have the city's ordinance effective on January 1st of 2023. Are there any questions?
Let me go ahead and start over here on the right side. Laura, what you got?
I agree with doing a short-term license as opposed to a business permit. I think they're 2 separate items. I'm curious why the 250, why the increase? Just because it's allowed, what's the rationale for the $250 fee?
I think Doug can probably answer that. He anticipates that the state law says that our fee cannot be more than actually we're spending with time. So we don't know what that's going to be yet. We talked about just keeping it at 75 and seeing if it increases, but the state law allows 250, but we know that city staff is going to spend more than $75 to kind of regulate an STR. So we don't know where that's going to fall yet.
Okay. Then, how will we know that the short-term rental owner has responded within a reasonable time? Is it the city? Do they have to respond to the city directly?
Yes. They need to provide us with an emergency contact, and which might be themselves if they're in town, but they may be living in Iowa or something. They may have somebody local. But if there is a large party going on or kind of a disturbance, or they rented it to the wrong person, and police staff are on time, we're going to be calling that contact person, and we'd like somebody to come out to the property within an hour to help disperse their own problem.
So generally we expect the police to be that initiator of the contact.
For the emergency contact.
For the
yes.
emergency contact. Now, since we have a provision to notify neighbors, will neighbors call owners directly, or what's their recourse? Are we going to tell them to call PD, or will they be initiating their own complaints?
I think always the answer to that question is they should be calling PD. I don't know that they want to get directly in the middle of the problem. I mean, if they call the property, I don't know that they know who's going to be answering the phone.
Okay. And lastly, you did answer the question why there's no license revocation, because it was silent, but I'm just curious, as a thought, if it's not mentioned, is it prohibited?
All the cities are starting to draft new STR ordinances after the passage of Senate Bill 1168. And the league says it's going to come out with a model ordinance. It just didn't say anything about it. And I don't know if, the VRBOs and the Airbnbs are going to take the position that the state law says you can't revoke.
I guess that's one of the things we'll have to watch and see how it unfolds then.
Yeah.
Great. I appreciate all the work that's been done, and I think we're on the right track.
Thank you. Councilmember Campbell?
Well, several of the neighborhoods that I know of do short-term rentals all the time because they're snowbirds and they rent their homes out for 2 months or 6 months or 4 months or 8 months or whatever. And I think we'll be hearing some pushback on some of those folks. But we really need to educate them on why we're doing it, and maybe they'll accept it better. Because right now, there's not a fee for them to do that, or if there is, they don't know it, and they're not utilizing it at all. They're just renting it within the communities of who they know. And so whatever we do, we've got to do a really heavy education component to let folks know what it is and why we're doing it.
Yeah, I think that's the idea with, almost taking, 2.5 months to try to educate as to
Yeah.
all we want is compliance, and City of Goodyear does not seem to have a problem like Scottsdale and Paradise Valley, but
No, they
I
don't,
think
but
we
they
want to
could.
head it off.
Yeah, I think they're just we're trying to head it off before we do. But my neighbors across the street bought their home as a retirement home, but they rent it out and they have no plans of moving here until the next 5 years. And so the home is turned over quite a bit, but we have restrictions and they have to abide by those restrictions. So that would be who would need to get a license then, correct?
That's correct. And the one thing that's interesting is a lot of the development or at least the newer development here in Goodyear, you have homeowners associations.
Yeah, that's what I'm speaking of, yeah.
And the homeowners associations can actually restrict more than the city can according to the state law. If you go to the Scottsdale area, you look at all the houses that were built in the 50s and 60s, kind of the smaller ranch ones,
Yeah.
before there was an HOA, and those are the ones that are getting gobbled up and actually
Did out, yeah.
bought and priced out because they know they don't have to deal with an HOA.
Well, then we may not have as big a problem as I thought we might, because you're right, the HOA has specific rules on how you can lease these homes out or rent them out, and you have to pay a fee to them as well. So it might be okay. We'll see.
And Mayor, if I may, Councilwoman Campbell, this will also only apply to those short-term rental properties 29 days or less. So for those folks that are renting their house for months at a
28
time,
days or less.
29 days or less is considered.
Oh,
So
we're
just a
not
short
allowed-
amount of
yeah,
period.
We're not allowed to rent under 30 days. So that takes care of that right there. So,
Right?
okay, thanks.
Vice Mayor?
No, yeah, thank you for the clarification, Jenna, because I was going to ask that question. So do long-term rentals have to follow the same type of requirements at all? We don't report those at all in the city, right?
No, on your consent agenda tonight, we are passing an unruly gathering ordinance, which is kind of a rewrite of one of our ordinances. And that ordinance actually applies to short-term rental, long-term rental, or owner-occupied. So it's kind of another tool that we're trying to give to PD and code enforcement to head off or try to stop the problems that some of the other cities are seeing right now.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure there's parity in both small business owners that are running the two different long-term or short-term, how we don't, because they're businesses at the end of the day, how you're renting out the houses. So I was curious. And then these that passed, is it written to where we have to follow these, or we could if we want to follow these new ordinances? Do we have a choice? Do we have to implement these if we don't want to?
Well, I mean, right now you don't have your short-term rental ordinance in front of you. The law just passed, but
Yeah.
once we pass it, it's a law on the books, and it'll be kind of up to PD and to code enforcement whether to,
So
for any violations, but otherwise they will be required to go get a license.
And Mayor, Vice Mayor Hampton, I believe what you're asking is if the state law is requiring us to do this or if it's optional.
it gives
And
more tools.
all of this is optional for
Optional.
each city to consider as they see fit.
Okay, so we don't have, even though it passed, we don't have to implement any of these if we don't want to, as a city, if we chose to.
No,
Yeah, that's
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Yeah, currently we have no ordinance. The original law just preempted us from having any type of regulation.
So,
Yeah.
Then they said you could have a registration system, and now, a couple years later, now it's a license or permit, so.
so Jay, I'm going to jump in here. Can you pull up your slide that kind of went through the recommended, go back one more. Okay, Councilmember or Vice Mayor Hampton, these are the options or the tools in the toolbox that the state legislature gave us as far as the short-term rental ordinance. And as Jay is recommending, we're recommending to council that you adopt all of them. But you don't have to. You can pick and choose out of the state statute if there's some of these, like community notification. If you don't want to require a community notification, we don't have to put that in the ordinance, but we're enabled by the state legislature to do that. So this is kind of a summary of what the state's allowed and what we're recommending for the ordinance, but we certainly don't have to enact all of them.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm okay having more tools. I'm curious what the league's going to say with what that's going to look like for other cities as well. I'd like to be at least somewhat equal, so you're not from one city to the next. If you have more properties, you can kind of get an idea of what to expect from city to city. But and then the other question is really just nuanced questions, but is the 1 hour emergency contact, I know we won't know until the league and other cities draft their laws. Is that, I think you mentioned the police, does someone have to be there in 1 hour, or you have to be notify somebody in 1 hour?
Our game plan was for the ordinance to require, if requested by the city, the police force, if they're on site, to show up within an hour.
Okay.
If they're there and there's, 50 people partying at a house and we're going to be calling the emergency contact and say, your renters are out of control, can you show up here within an hour? And we're going to expect that.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure it's reasonable. I'm trying to think if I live in another city in Arizona and I need to come across the valley to go there or whatever that looks like, or if I need to be part of a bigger organization so I can have someone maintain that. I just make sure it's, like I said, I just want to make sure it's reasonable. I don't want out of control parties, but I also want to make sure the business owners can do business efficiently in the cities as well. And a lot of these things have already, with our permit, not our license, our permit, existing permit, there already is a contact information on there, right? It's just they're not required to be there or be contacted within an hour. Is that true?
What information is gathered on a business license? I don't know. I assume it's the property owner or whoever applied for the business license.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just looking at your the screenshot here on the slide 6. So if that was the new one or the old one, but yeah, I just want to make sure it's reasonable for the business owner to be able to do business. And then your slide on where to go on, just make sure for clarification's sakes, for slide 13 on the last bullet, when you say liquor, what does that mean? You can't sell liquor, or you can't have liquor, or in the home? Or...
Yeah, that was a phrase from the ordinance that I kind of shortened up a little bit, but yeah, I don't think any single family home is going to have a liquor license and be able to sell liquor. So if you...
Is that what it's targeting there?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I assume there's going to be alcohol in most of these houses, so, but,
Yes.
okay, let's make sure. Okay. I think everything's good. I mean, I just want to make sure that, like I said, it's reasonable, and that we're not making it too restrictive, but people can still operate and they're still safe in our community, so.
Yeah, and it is up to the council if you don't think 1 hour is reasonable. I mean, it's just something that another city had in place. Scottsdale had that in place prior to this new law change.
Yeah, I'm just curious how practical, if any cities have actually seen that and how we might say we want an hour, but I don't know if we're going to meet, I don't know if we're going to meet that criteria. It might be,
I think it's going to be up to PD. If PD calls some contact and they're, all the way in the other side of Mesa and they're making their way over, I don't know that, is PD going to,
be there with the watch.
be there with the watch and.
Yeah, but they could enforce it, so.
Yes, they could, and there's always going to be discretion though, but at least that's what the chief tells us.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm okay with most of it. I just, like I said, I don't like to make it, so like I said, just so it's reasonable and practical for everybody in this, everybody who, the police and also the business owners. So, thank you.
Councilmember Loretano.
There we go. Thank you very much for your presentation, because I know this has been kind of an issue with our residents ongoing, and it's, first, we had absolutely no regulation and no ability to regulate. So I appreciate that we do have a little bit more tools in those toolbox to do that. I also know Airbnb, I think, is striking down some of their, trying to keep those party, so-called no-one party houses off their site as well, the one-day rentals where you rent it for one day, have a party, have the open bar, and I think as Councilmember Hampton was talking about the alcohol, have the open bar, the DJ. I mean, that's what some of these have gone to. And I love Airbnb. I've used it a lot, but I think there's a difference between responsible use and then the people that turn their home in a neighborhood into a party house. So I do like the fact that you do have a license. I think that's a great idea. Councilmember Kano brought up the issue about the suspension. How long is this suspension for? Because it could be kind of an indefinite suspension in a way. If they keep violating, is it a 6-month suspension, a 1-year suspension? I mean, you could suspend yourself right off.
You can only suspend for 12 months.
So they're off for 12 months and then they get a fresh slate?
Yes.
Okay. And so when, how about if they do something during the suspension? If they ignore this, I mean, what does that cause? Is that a crime? Do we cite them?
I think that would be a code violation of criminal kind of illegal land use.
Okay. And then we talked about the HOA, you covered that, and the long and short-term rentals. When does it start to hit the legal definition of a hotel? I know that's been an issue too. When does it hit a short-term, long-term, 28, 29 days? And then when does it go to what would be considered the regulations under a hotel? If you know, or maybe Rick knows.
I think
curious.
you're almost right there with a hotel or motel. I mean, I've used Airbnb and VRBO for one night, so
Yeah.
I don't think there's much of a difference. I mean, there's just it's interesting. The rental property lobby is very strong, and we had no ability to regulate it all. 3 years later, we could have a registration system. Now, 3 years later, we can have a license and permit. And it's kind of interesting up at the state, there's some type of agreement with a moratorium for 3 years. So I don't know what we're going to be looking at in 3 years from now.
Okay, and then the other question I have, when you talk about the criminal violations, do those actually have to be convictions or just citations?
Convictions.
Oh, so it would be the date of conviction for 3 and 12 months?
Right, so if you think about it, a verified violation is a conviction, or the court has found you guilty of a civil violation. And all those take time, those processes.
Yeah.
So our ability, according to the state laws, after 3 verified violations, unless something really bad happens at the property.
So if we have someone, if there's some sort of sexual offense or something, a major felony going on, but it isn't a conviction, do we have the ability to suspend this person's license?
In the state law, it said, if there's something really bad and horrible that happens, that the city its ordinance you can go straight and to the court and ask for an immediate kind of suspension.
So there is a way if something really bad happens, we don't have to wait 2 years to get through the court system. And
That's correct.
okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of the protections. Like I said, I really do like Airbnbs, and I think this is a solution to a very small minority that are causing the biggest problem, at least in our city. I think we've got a few party houses here and there, but I don't think we have an overwhelming problem. And I think, let's see if there's any other questions that I have. The only other comment I have is I'm okay with the 1 hour. I think that seems to be a reasonable standard. Like you said, they're not going to be sitting there with a stopwatch. As long as they're on their way, I don't think you could even make a case that to violate them if they were on their way driving here and hit traffic on the I-10. I think that would be pretty fair to say.
Yeah, the discussion with staff kind of internally is how long are we going to make the police sit there until
Exactly.
somebody else shows up? And so it's kind of a,
But if they've called them and they're on their way, they're like, okay, we're coming from Mesa, we're now at I-10 and 83rd Avenue. It's like, okay, we know you're on your way. When we're not wasting our resources, because if we say 3 hours and we've got to have police stay there for 3 hours, and the party might keep on going until somebody gets there to deal with their renters. So I think that's a good one, and then we can just use reasonableness for that. So thank you very much. I'm supporting. I think it's good first steps to protect our residents and those good Airbnbs that do work in our community.
Councilmember Stipp.
Jay, thank you for all the effort, Jenna and everybody on staff. This is really about, kind of protecting our neighborhoods. We've got a couple of places in the community that that proverbial party house exists, and it is really disruptive to the neighborhood. And the neighbors feel completely helpless. They turn to the city, and we've been completely hopeless as well. So I think us being able to take advantage of everything that the state has allowed us to is the best defense that we have to say to our residents, we've done everything that we possibly can do. Here is legislator so-and-so's phone number, or here's, that kind of activity. I think the 1 hour is reasonable. If I decided to rent my house out as a short-term rental and move up to Flagstaff, that is not a reasonable. That's not a reasonable expectation that I'm going to come down here in an hour. I mean, it's my responsibility is to have somebody here. And I think to Sherry's point, yeah, we are having to create these rules for the small few that are creating havoc for the thousands of the people that are doing it correctly. So this ordinance is, I'd say it's overdue, but it's not our fault. So I'm on board with that. I have shared this information from tonight's meeting with a few residents that I have heard from, and look forward to their feedback before this comes back to us in September. But knowing that this is all we're able to do, I think is reassuring that we haven't really left a lot of wiggle room through that. So just, again, thank you very much for getting this, A, to us before break, and then B, being prepared to deal with it right after break. So we get this all done before Super Bowl, which obviously could be in February. So you cannot claim in February that you were unaware, because we gave you all of September, all of October, all of November, all of December to kind of get it together. So I think this is a tremendous move forward.
Councilmember Bray.
Thank you both for bringing this forward. I look forward to see how long that moratorium lasts at the legislature. But that being said, my question here is, like Councilmember Stipp said, he's reached out to some of his neighbors and got some feedback there. And I know that there has been some residents that have mentioned it. Is there a way in here that before we get to September 12th that we at least notify those that we have on file to say, hey, here's what we're looking at, and see if we can't solicit some feedback before the 12th, and maybe there's something we haven't thought about, or maybe, we get enough feedback that the $250 is a little egregious, or is there a way that we can contact those folks that are responsibly doing this?
I would think so. I mean, we must have,
You got
know,
Doug coming up.
everyone has got to be licensed, to have a business license. But
One of the things that we are looking at is contracting with a company that keeps track of all the short-term rentals, and this whole thing would be administered through them. We already have a contract in place that we put in place under the original one. We could actually reach out to them beforehand, and I would assume we would be able to get a listing of everybody that's there right now and do that initial contact prior to that September timeframe.
I think I don't disagree with a lot of the stuff that's on there, but I think that it would at least be beneficial and part of the education process if we have a list of people already doing it to say, hey, here's what we're thinking. And is there something that, you absolutely can't live with? We still make the decision, but maybe there's something we haven't seen. I mean, they're in that business, so I think it would behoove us to at least ask them and see what they think about the regulation coming down the pipeline. I don't necessarily disagree with the 1 hour, and I certainly hear the scenarios that are on the table, and especially what Mr. Stipp has said about somebody that lives in Flagstaff or whatever. That makes a lot of sense. So my question is, and maybe this is for Chief Rodriguez, is how does this 1 hour scenario actually play out? Because so here's in my mind, right? You have a party that's completely out of control. You have the cops on scene. They are taking care of it, right? So now are we saying, okay, you need to respond to that and clear these people out, or what? How does that play out in the real world?
Good evening, Mayor and Council. So the 1 hour is just that. In an emergency, we would ask that somebody come out. So just because we go and knock on somebody's door and they're having a party inside doesn't mean that they have to answer the door to us. Once again, we might have an emergency contact that will be able to come on site that has the authority to go in and stop that party. So there are many different uses for it. We understand that if you're coming from the East Valley, you might take an hour and 15 minutes. The main goal is to get somebody that's responsible for that property on the phone right away so they can start working with the officers. Initially, when we go to some of these calls for service, we try to give a warning because they have to know that they're causing a disturbance. So we try to give them a warning. Once again, this emergency contact will allow us to let them know right away. We've already been out to your property. If we go back out there again, somebody's going to be cited or the party's going to be broken up. It gives them the opportunity to police themselves and to take care of their own business.
So on that particular warning scenario, you are notifying the people that are renting the house, correct? Or are you also notifying the property owners?
We're notifying the people that are at the location, at the property, that are either renting the house or that are there. But then also we're notifying the emergency contact on there that we've gone out there. Because ultimately for a disorderly conduct charge, we still have to have the victim. The officer can't be the victim in that case. So once again, many times neighbors don't want to be the victim or whoever's calling in. So we want to work with that property owner to solve that situation as soon as possible before it does get out of hand.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. Appreciate it. So then I really do agree with the big part about notifying the neighbors on that scenario. So what happens if you are currently operating a short-term rental? We pass this regulation, then the neighbors are notified, even though you may be in operation already today?
it's my understanding that the state law allows us to require neighborhood notification for a new short-term rental, one that's not already in existence.
Okay. Well, I think that, I thank you for the clarification for the 1 hour. It makes a lot more sense, but I think it would be beneficial for us to do a little bit more outreach with the people that do this and the public to start that education process. Those questions that we have, maybe we get ahead of them, like those in Pebble Creek, that won't impact them. Let our residents know that if you already got one, you're not going to get notified, you know, that kind of thing. I think that little time space we have in there, I think a little more outreach to the public and see if we can get feedback would be beneficial for the process.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. it says before offering a vacation rental or short-term rental for rent for the first time. We're able to require neighborhood notification, and city staff did debate that too. Are we going to recommend neighborhood notification or not? If you tell everybody in the neighborhood diagonally across, do you just infuriate everyone? And it may be the best run short-term rental or not. So that seemed to be a double-edged sword to us also.
Yeah, I agree. There's a challenge. I know we recently had one pop up in our neighborhood, and some days you don't notice it, and then other days there's 30 cars on the street. So it's a challenge.
You good? Mm-hmm. I kind of agree with the discussion here. Just a couple things. I've had some neighbors in my neighborhood come up to me, and I try to explain to them what we could do and can't do, but something was forthcoming, and would keep them in the loop. And they were appreciative of that, because there's been a couple in the neighborhood that have gotten out of hand. And when the neighbors would go over and ask them to calm it down, they just wouldn't listen. Or if the police would come out, they'd calm down and then go right back to making the rackets at 1 and 2 in the morning, which is kind of disruptive for a neighborhood. So, I mean, this is mainly for those that are destroying, the neighborhood itself. But the one thing I would ask the fellow council members to consider is at $250. I think what we want to do is create an incentive for people to comply and not create havoc out in the neighborhood with large parties. But I would think you'd want them to register. And I think $250 might discourage that. I'm thinking a little bit less. I don't know what that number may be for them, but I'm asking my other fellow council members. I think $250 is too high. It will discourage the registration as opposed to something maybe 100 or less. Just give that some thought, because I think what you want to do is get them to register so you know who they are, as opposed to some skirting it because they just don't want to pay the money. So just a thought, throw out there for everybody. I'm more worried about the $250 as kind of discouraging from registering. Go ahead, Councilmember Stipp.
Is there a penalty clause or something in the ordinance that says if you don't register, that there's something? I noticed that wasn't one of the bullets, but.
Yes, there is.
I figured there would be, but. That's what I thought, but as long as it's in there, Jay, we can talk about it in September. If I own my house and I decide to rent it, I have to pay 2.5% sales tax. So I will charge that to my renters, et cetera. I will pay much more than $250 for that rental of my home. So if I'm doing it on a short-term basis, I'm doing it weekend, I'm paying nothing to the city, and yet I'm creating a potential for all this problem. I don't think $250 is that big of a deal.
Well, you know we're not getting sales tax from those, right?
Mayor,
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
So if I rent my house I'm renting it long-term, so we'll use a long-term rental, I theoretically have to pay the 2.5. If I'm doing it short-term, if we don't have some equivalent fee in there, then I'm paying nothing.
Well, even long-term, you're not paying unless you have less than, 3? Is that right, Doug? If you have a single and you rent it long-term, you're still not paying sales tax.
If you have a less than 3, or if you have 3 or more, or work with a management company, you're paying sales tax on long-term rentals. On short-term rentals, there is sales tax involved when you do that, if they are registered, if they have a license, if they report it. Through Airbnb actually collects that and reports that on their behalf. State law already requires them to post their TPT license somewhere on there, unless the online provider is paying the sales taxes on their behalf.
So I'll just make sure I understand that. Short-term, they would pay.
They will pay.
Long-term, they would not unless they have 3 or more.
Unless they have 3 or more, correct.
Oh, okay. Or they use a management
company.
Okay. Yeah, I can go either way with the 250. All I'm saying is I want to encourage them to register. And I don't know if 250 will do it or not. And you're correct, Councilmember Stipp. I understand with the 250, they're getting, I know in our neighborhood, a couple grand for some of these properties for doing these party houses, so to speak. So 250 is not a big deal on there, but I was looking for a happy medium somewhere so that they will actually register. But did you say there was a penalty if they don't register?
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. It says that in addition to other penalties, if you do not provide the contact, obviously you don't get a license, the city's ordinance could require $1,000 for every 30 days that the owner is just not signing up.
Well, if there's $1,000 in there, I think the 250 will encourage them to to register.
In the 250, the actual, we have to, according to state law, post fees for up to 60, at least 60 days prior, and you can adopt anything less up to that fee. So it can be 250 or less. We actually justified a fee of just under $300. 250 is what the cap of state law is, and that includes both some direct costs, like the cost of a third-party provider, as well as some indirect costs. We can very easily break it down so that a fee is anything from 0 to 250 and justify how that is, and even show council where it would cover 100% of staff cost and where you're starting getting to indirect and enforcement as well.
Yeah, and I think that would be helpful when we get back in September, to meet on this. So, listen, I appreciate all you're doing on this. I can tell you my experience with my neighborhood that there are people concerned about this. And again, there's a lot of people who are doing it that are above board. Don't, when they're renting, they screen them. They're not partying till 1 and 2 in the morning. And there are some that just disregard the rights of their neighbors. So I really appreciate what you're doing. Yes, go ahead, manager.
Thank you, Mayor and Council, for the conversation. Councilmember Bray had suggested that we do the draft ordinance and get feedback from residents and people who are renting. I just wanted to see if there was council consensus to pursue that action.
Any consensus here?
If I might, I don't necessarily think that we have to put out the full draft ordinance, just to save some time and work, but slide 14 basically has everything that we're considering and, include the $250 registration fee. And basically that, and say,
What do you think?
What do you think? I think putting out the whole draft would be nice, but I think it's time consuming. I also think that people don't necessarily understand them. So I think you're better off hitting the highlights, saying, here's what we're considering. What's the feedback?
And
If
we do a
that's
Survey
appropriate to
Monkey?
you.
How's everybody feel about that on the council? Councilmember Kano?
I'm not in favor of giving the whole draft. I think we want to get their opinion, but not co-legislate. And so I think to the high view, like you said, the slides with about upcoming changes, if there are businesses we're aware of and work with, I think that would be fine.
It may be easier to follow the actual ordinance if you hit those high pieces like you're talking about, Councilmember Bray. So this is what we're looking at, as far as those pieces. So if you get that out, when we get our feedback from the neighborhoods, maybe will get you will give us more direction on where that wants to go. But it seems like we got consensus here, correct?
Are we talking about doing just a notification for those that currently have licenses and let them know we're going to meet on the 14th to pass this ordinance? Is that what you're suggesting?
I would suggest anybody we know, not just the ones, and because I think if I heard Doug correctly, there's a company out there that tracks all of these, or probably a vast majority of them. Is that accurate?
Yes, there's a company that we're contracted with. We can contact them to see if prior to executing that contract that they would do a notification for us if we paid for the postage and that kind of stuff along with it. I'm sure they would, because it's going to generate fees for them. But I think it's between 400 and 500 that they know of in the city. So it would not be a substantial sum of money just to send a notification that says council will be talking about this topic on this date.
So if I could, I guess that's notifying people who are operating short-term rentals. Do we want just that feedback, or do we also want feedback from the residents on the ordinance prior to consideration? So I just wanted to clarify, this is a different process than we've used before, and I just wanted to clarify.
I think the residents are just as important, at least the feedback I'm getting in the neighborhood. They want to know what's going on out there and what are some of the options. I'm not sure how you would do that. how you would get the feedback with our, what is it, 102,000 residents that we got out there. That would probably be somewhat of a challenge. Open to ideas or suggestions on that. But my feedback has been from the public is that they want us to do something to try to curtail the party houses. Go ahead, Councilmember Stipp.
You know, I appreciate the idea of doing it, but we would not do this for any other ordinance that we've ever passed before. And I don't know if we want to start doing that for all of the ordinances going forward. We have the public process for the ordinance. You know, we have what is being suggested here. I keep looking at all the green check marks. What is being suggested is the maximum amount we can do by the law. So I don't know what good we're going to do and what damage we'll do to the timeline, because the timeline is really critical to this, us getting it passed and getting the communication piece out. If we push this 30 days, now that's 30 less days of us getting to those homeowners and whatnot. I don't know that it's that big of a deal. I'd hate to go through the gyration. So I'm not necessarily in favor of doing anything.
Of anything.
I do have a suggestion, perhaps, in listening to Councilmember Stipp. You know, we could send a notification through that system saying that council is going to be considering an ordinance on September 14th. And I think that might be more manageable than saying, here's a proposal, what feedback do you have for us? Because anyone's able to appear and provide impact to mayor and council. So that's a thought where we could provide notification to that group, because they will clearly be impacted by the ordinance adoption, but give them the opportunity to participate in the public process as compared to soliciting feedback. And maybe that's splitting a hair, but maybe that's how we could approach it.
It makes sense to me. How about everybody else?
Yeah, I think the public process is the already in place, but just making sure that the larger users know that the public process is happening, which I'm sure they do.
I agree. I think that's the way to go, what the city manager said. Otherwise, we might find ourselves in a position where all these separate groups are going to have very, very specific needs and wants, and then we're going to start pulling, and it, like Councilmember Stipp said, that will never get through, because it'll be like, this group wants this group wants that. And then we'd have to educate as we send it out, if we did that to all these different groups, why we're doing it, why we hadn't done anything before, it wasn't because of us. So I think it kind of leads it to a lot more information and a lot more cumbersome process. So I agree with what the city manager says. Anyone can come speak, and then if something big comes up, we can always make those changes.
Okay, everybody on board? We good? Sounds like you got it there, Julie. And with that, if we have regular meeting begins at 6, so we've got 8 minutes. This meeting is adjourned.